So, the topic we're going to be discussing today are the challenges of improving your English pronunciation, as well as some tips and strategies for how to teach students. So, some topics we're going to cover are the difference between pronunciation and accent, the importance of having good pronunciation, some common mistakes and errors for Brazilian speakers, teaching English as a non-native speaker, and some tips and strategies. So, the first thing is the difference between pronunciation and accent. They are very closely related. So, pronunciation is the way we produce sounds and how we use our mouth and tongue to actually make words. And an accent is a pattern of pronunciation. It includes things like word stress, your intonation, words that you contract, the rhythm of your speech, and it can even include the word choice you have. And with English, there are so many different accents. Just within English-speaking countries, you have American accents, Canadian, British, UK, and Australian. And within the United States, there are countless regional accents. So just for example, in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, I can tell if someone is from north, south, east, or west Pennsylvania just by how they pronounce the word water. So I'm from central Pennsylvania. I pronounce it with a D, water. But if you're from eastern Pennsylvania, they say water with like a U instead of an A. And there are also very iconic American accents, like the Southern accent, where the rhythm is slow and they draw the words out more, and Boston, California accents. So there is no one English accent, is the point here. And as teachers teaching English or students of English, it's important to know that you don't have to erase your native accent, because these accents are part of what makes the language interesting and unique. And a lot of people see their accent as part of their identity. You can tell, if a person speaking English is originally from Argentina or Mexico or China. But what we need to pay attention for is when accent gets in the way of understanding. So if the accent is too heavy, we might need to work on a little accent reduction. But accent isn't a bad thing. All right. So the importance of good pronunciation. It increases your professionalism and authority, and this is especially important for students who use English at work and for teachers of English. Another reason it's important is that when you have good pronunciation, the listener doesn't have to work hard to understand what you're saying, and instead they can focus on the content of what you're saying. Just an example here, I took a class in college where my professor was from China, and one class, he spent the whole class repeating this word missionary, like a religious person who has like a goal
Yes.
or some sort of uh, project. And when the class was over, I was really confused, and I asked the person next to me what missionaries had to do with our course, and they told me that he was saying machinery, not missionary. And the whole class was lost on me because I misunderstood everything.
I see.
So, poor pronunciation can cause these misunderstandings, and sometimes they can have negative consequences. Um, and I think that it's important to highlight here that you can have perfect grammar and an amazing vocabulary, but if you have bad pronunciation, you might not be understood. But on the other side, if you have good pronunciation, but you make some grammar mistakes, you'll still be understood. So this just highlights the importance of having good pronunciation.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yes.
All
What's the
right.
goal?
So the goal here. Um, English is a language that is spoken all over the planet, in every corner of the earth. So, with that in mind, everyone's going to speak English a little differently, and they'll have a slightly different accent. So, the goal here is not to have a perfect American or a perfect British accent. What we want is for our students to be able to communicate their ideas, to be understood, to be confident in their speaking skills, and we also want them to be able to well, continue to learn outside of the classroom because when our students use English in the real world, the teacher isn't going to be. So we want to give them the tools. All right, some challenges. English is a really difficult language for many, many reasons, and especially when it comes to pronunciation. And the main reasons it's so difficult is because we have this conflict between spelling, pronunciation, and meanings of words. So the English language is full of homonyms. For example, here we have bright. It can mean a person who is intelligent, and bright meaning a lot of light. They are spelled and sound exactly the same, but they have different meanings. We've got a lot of homophones. So the first allowed here means you have permission, allowed, but spelled differently, allowed means to like speak with volume in your voice out loud. Um, and we also have heteronyms. So these two words are spelled exactly the same. The first one, close, like something is nearby, or the second one, close, like to close the door or shut it. So these cause lots of confusion, especially when it comes to pronunciation and knowing how to say a word when you read it. Another thing that causes some difficulties is word stress. Which syllable in the word we put the stress on? So here for an example, we have the word record, which is a verb, and record, which is the noun. Record, record. Um, and the third point here are silent letters and absent letters. So the silent letters, like the words no and island, The K is not pronounced in no, and the S is not pronounced in island. But especially for lower level learners, they want to pronounce every letter they see. So you might hear them say Kno or Island.
Yeah, Kino or Island, yes.
Yeah. And another even more difficult one, I think, are these absent letters. And this is when we pronounce a letter that isn't in the word at all. So the first word, once, we pronounce it with a W sound, even though there's no W in the word. And the second word, laugh, we put the F sound on the end of the word, laugh. Um, but my students in particular never know how to pronounce this word, and they'll often say log or log,
Lauge. Yes.
which is completely understandable. There's no F there, but these can make pronunciation very difficult. And one of the last common challenges that we have with pronunciation is how many different vowel sounds the English language has. We have 16 different vowel sounds. So an O does not always make the same sound. Here we have 3 different words. They're all 4 letters, with the second letter being O. And we have dove, lose, and wolf. All completely different sounds. So, challenge to know which sound a word is supposed to have. Just a funny clip from the Pink Panther movie with the inspector taking an English class. It highlights some of these challenges. Okay. Now, some common mistakes and errors for Brazilian speakers. Um, Here, I'm going to just highlight a few, but this video that I have, the speaker in the video goes through the top 10 most common mistakes for Brazilian speakers. And what I really like about the video is that she explains why Brazilians make these mistakes and where the root of the problem is in the Portuguese language. So it really helps to understand what the common mistakes are and why you make them. And that can help you break these bad habits. So the first one is pronouncing to as chew, like tomorrow.
Yes.
I
Very common
hear it a
mistake.
lot. Yeah. Adding vowel sounds to the ends of words, like e and same e. And this also adds an extra syllable to the word, which can be confusing. Um, Pronouncing the R as an H sound. So instead of record, students would say record or remember. So they have trouble making that hard R sound. Um,
And also when they
a lot of
say, instead of saying tomorrow, they say tomorrow.
yes. Yeah, a lot. I hear that. That's a very hard word, I guess. Chumaho.
Yes.
Let's see. Pronouncing the final M on a word as an N. So in Portuguese, when a word ends with M, it has an N sound. So students will carry that over to English also. Um, ED endings are particularly hard for students. It's very common for students pronounce all ED endings with the id sound when there are three possible ED sounds. So students will often say stop id instead of stopped with the T sound. Um, and misplaced stress is another common mistake. Um, in longer English words, the stress is usually on the first or second syllable, but you'll often hear students place stress later. So students might say frustrating instead of frustrating, or comfortable instead of comfortable. And the last one is with the schwa sound, which is the So many the pure vowel sounds. So students will say about instead of about, or focus instead of focus, or holiday. The video covers a take the opportunity to look at that when you get the chance. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was important to touch on non-native English-speaking teachers um, because there is a lot of debate, about whether non-native English-speaking teachers can be good. And the answer is yes, absolutely. You don't have to have an American accent or a perfect pronunciation to be an English teacher. And sometimes there are even great benefits to being a non-native speaker. They often have greater understanding and sympathy for students' needs because they were a student at one point too. And these non-native speakers can be very good role models for students. They can see the progress that you've made as a non-native speaker, and it's something for them to strive for. Whereas a native English speaker might have or set unrealistic expectations. And the second point with non-native speakers is that they often better understand concepts and can explain them better. Native speakers don't often have to think about these concepts and aren't very good at explaining them because they're just innate to us. And this goes for both grammar and pronunciation. I had a student just ask me the other day when I we were talking about collocations, and I was explaining that it's always jealous of, never jealous to or jealous for. And he asked me how I know that, like what grade I learned that in. This is not something we know. We're not taught it. So I can't explain how I know that. It's just always jealous of.
I see.
So uh, so sometimes non-native speakers have an advantage here. But it is very important to remember that your students will speak English how they hear it. So it is helpful to use video and audio in your classes. And this is especially important if you have a strong accent yourself or know that you make some pronunciation mistakes. But it's also good to just expose your students to different accents and different styles of speaking because everyone speaks differently. Okay.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Some strategies improving your English pronunciation. Um, as a teacher, it's really important to have a plan for making corrections and to often focus on certain sounds. So, students often have this feeling that their teachers let their pronunciation mistakes go without correcting them. So, it's helpful to set up a plan. So, for example, in my classes, when a student is reading a passage, we stop at the end of every paragraph. But fix the mistakes. Um, the second point to read dictionary pronunciation. And I think this second point here is a good idea. Um, so that when students look up words in the dictionary, they can learn the definition, but also be able to where the stress is on the word and what kind of vowel sounds they're supposed to make. But this is good for some students. Some students might just get confused by it. So you know your students best and can decide what's helpful. Um, Another strategy that I find really useful is to make students aware of the parts of their mouth and their throat. So when you're teaching pronunciation, you need to talk about where your tongue goes. Does it go between your teeth? Is it behind your teeth? In the back of your mouth? Um, and we often talk about the throat when we're making voiced and unvoiced sounds. So you can feel your vocal cords vibrate when you make those voiced sounds. So, for example, here we have these three words: though, throw, and toe. For though, your teeth or your tongue goes in between your teeth, outside a little, and you can feel your vocal cords vibrate. Though, with throw, your tongue goes just under your teeth. It's not quite outside. Throw, and your vocal cords vibrate a little less. And with the last one, toe, your tongue is behind your teeth and your vocal cords don't vibrate at all. So it's helpful for students to have this reference so they can know when they're making the right sounds. Breaking words down into individual sounds, especially with longer, more complicated words, is really helpful. So break it down into individual sounds and then bring them together, say it a little faster, and work towards making it sound natural. And part of this strategy can be really exaggerating those sounds. It might sound silly, it sounds unnatural, but it's a good way to practice making those difficult sounds. Um, Speaking slowly is very important. Oftentimes, when students have a lot of things to say, they speak very fastly, their pronunciation just goes out the window. So it's important to emphasize speaking slowly, making sure we get the sounds right. and then work on speaking more quickly. Um, it's also helpful to work with minimal pairs. These are words that only differ in one sound, like bad, bed, bead. When you put words like between those vowel sounds that are often so difficult. And the last one, it's a really good idea to have students record themselves. I know everybody hates the sound of their own voice, and I do too. But students often have trouble hearing what they're saying as they say it. They think that they're saying it correctly. So if they record themselves, they can play it back and actually hear the mistakes they're making, which is a good reference point for them. And they can compare it to how it's supposed to be said. And you don't need any special equipment to do that. I think pretty much every smartphone has a record function on it. Okay. Some different games or activities that you can do to practice pronunciation. For younger students, nursery rhymes and tongue twisters are very fun. They can really emphasize some of those difficult sounds. Maybe it's the R sound or the TH or some of those vowel sounds. And it makes pronunciation fun because everybody's going to sound a little silly. So off to the side here, we have just two different tongue twisters. The second one is probably one of the most common tongue twisters in English. She sells seashells by the seashore.
Yeah.
And the first one I like because it emphasizes a lot of the different vowel sounds, all with the B and T. Betty bought some butter, but she said the butter's bitter. It will make my batter bitter. But a bit of better butter will make my batter better. So Betty bought a bit of better butter.
That's difficult.
So it's very it's very difficult. And then, you can work up towards saying them faster and faster. And it's just a fun activity. Let's see. We also have, you can play the card game Go Fish. And this is helpful with homophones. So you give your students 5, 6, 7 cards each, and they ask the other students, do you have a word that sounds like plane? And you're just trying to get your students to recognize that the words can be pronounced the same but have very different spellings. And you can also play memory games with those challenging aspects of the language too. Homophones or even stressed syllables and vowel sounds. The telephone game is and popular with the younger students. It might not be very practical now in our current health climate, but that's the game where you have students sit in a circle on the floor. You whisper a sentence to one student. They whisper it to the next student if it ends the same way that it began. And the last three here are good for more adult students and also for teaching online. You can turn your microphone on mute and practice really exaggerating the shape of your mouth to make the sounds, and student a list of maybe 5 sentences,
Hmm.
mute, say them, really exaggerating the mouth movements, and see if they can guess what you're saying.
Wow, really interesting.
Yeah. Um, you can also have your students take diction. So it can be either you as the teacher or another student who reads a sentence or two, and the other student writes what they hear. So lets them practice listening and spelling, but it really gets them to focus on the sounds that they hear. And lastly, um, Google Docs has a function on the tools menu called voice typing, and you can turn it on, and the Google Docs will type exactly what you say. So your student can read a short passage out loud and see if the app understands everything that they say. So I tested this the other day, and just for example, if your student pronounces stopped instead of stopped, Google Docs will type stop it as
It.
2 separate words.
Okay.
So um, this is another activity you can do to help your students realize where some of their pronunciation weaknesses might be. So these are just some options that you can play around with. But of all, I think that it's just really important to give your students feedback and support and encouragement because pronunciation is very difficult and a lot of students feel very uh, uncomfortable with their pronunciation or their accent. They can be very self-conscious. So when your student reads a passage with particularly good pronunciation, make sure you let them know. And be sympathetic, of course, because there's a lot of challenges, as we saw, with having good pronunciation. And the last thing I have here is just a list of some resources that can be helpful with both improving pronunciation and with improving your students. The first is a YouTube channel called Rachel's English. She has a lot of very good videos explaining different sounds in the English language. And I think she does a good job of really explaining how to shape your mouth and where your tongue should be to make those sounds. The next two, Voice of America and TED Talks. These are good resources just for including audio and video in your classes. Uh, OA has a podcast even that you can choose topics that are interesting to you and listen to a 10 or 12-minute podcast about it. And TED Talks are really helpful for hearing different accents. Um, we were mentioning earlier about how it's good to expose your students um, to these different accents and different ways of speaking. And then we also have the phonetic alphabet, and audio files, some aids, and then some tips for teaching pronunciation and to take a look at when you have a minute. And that's all I have for right now. So hopefully you can find some helpful information in here.
Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay.